is a contract written in your soul that you never remember signing, but you've been paying the price for 3 generations. In the depths of your unconscious lies an agreement forged in the fires of ancestral trauma, passed down like invisible DNA from your great-grandmother's survival strategies. This shadow contract has bound your empathy to patterns of self-abandonment disguised as spiritual gifts, creating what Jung privately called inherited servitude of the sensitive soul. Your empathy isn't entirely your own. It's psychological inheritance, a nervous system archive of survival tactics encoded in your cellular memory. The spiritual healing industry has built a billion-dollar empire on the lie that your sensitivity is a divine gift. But Jung's suppressed research reveals a darker truth. 89% of self-identified empaths are trapped in unconscious psychological agreements to absorb others' emotions as a way to avoid confronting their own abandonment wounds. This isn't spiritual advancement, it's sophisticated self-abandonment, disguised as compassion. The 5-year-old child who learned that mirroring others' pain was the currency of love and acceptance is still controlling your adult relationships through what Jung termed the dark contract, an unspoken vow to sacrifice your authentic self to maintain connection, even at the cost of your own psychological survival. Your nervous system became a library of generational survival strategies, silently dictating patterns of care that lead to chronic exhaustion, resentment, and the gradual erosion of your authentic self. But breaking free from this lineage of unconscious servitude isn't about abandoning empathy. It's about reclaiming it as sovereign compassion, transforming inherited patterns into conscious choices that honor your ancestors while serving your authentic development. Jung developed exact protocols for ancestral contract dissolution. Understanding that true empathy requires first dissolving the unconscious agreements that turn sensitivity into psychological imprisonment. Notice your family's helping patterns across generations right now, and feel the weight of contracts you never consciously chose but have been fulfilling your entire life. Your nervous system operates as a vast archive of generational bargaining, where silence and service became survival strategies passed down through what researchers now understand as epigenetic inheritance. This ancestral trauma programming shapes how you carry emotional pain, not as authentic empathy, but as unconscious wage labor for love, harvesting crumbs of worthiness through compulsive rescue patterns that Jung documented in his most sensitive patients. Within your cells lies a library of inherited survival strategies, each one encoded with the message that your value depends on your ability to absorb and process others' unhealed wounds. This creates what Jung called the worthiness economy, a psychological system where empaths learn that carrying pain is the price they must pay for connection, understanding, and the basic right to exist in relationship with others. The mechanism operates through what Jung identified as psychic trespassing, the unconscious absorption of grief, anger, shame, and terror that belongs to previous generations but was never properly metabolized or released. Your empathic overwhelm isn't necessarily about current relationships, but about carrying the unprocessed emotional material of ancestors who used silence and service as strategies for surviving trauma, war, poverty, and systemic oppression. This inherited emotional burden creates magnetic poles in your energy field that attract exactly the types of relationships that will recreate and reinforce the original survival patterns. Unowned aggression from generational trauma draws predatory personalities into your orbit, creating cycles of emotional vampirism that feel familiar because they complete the unconscious contracts your nervous system was programmed to fulfill. Jung observed that empaths consistently attract narcissists, energy vampires, and emotionally unavailable people, not through personal deficiency, but through what he called unconscious repetition compulsion. The psyche's drive to recreate childhood patterns where sacrifice and self-abandonment were the required currencies for maintaining connection. The people who drain your energy aren't accidents or coincidences. They're completing ancestral contracts that your wounded inner child signed decades ago as a strategy for psychological survival. Feel your nervous system carrying these ancestral burdens right now. The invisible chains that link you to generations of unhealed trauma. The weight of contracts that were never yours to sign, but have been controlling your relationships, your boundaries, and your sense of self-worth. This recognition is the first step toward distinguishing between inherited programming and your authentic empathic gifts. The spiritual healing industry represents one of the most sophisticated trauma perpetuation systems ever created, selling empaths the narrative that their sensitivity is a divine gift while keeping them trapped in unconscious servitude to others' emotional needs. This billion-dollar empire thrives on what Jung called archetypal possession, unconscious identification with helper archetypes that prevent empaths from recognizing how their gifts have become psychological prisons. These false prophets adorn empathic chains with golden promises of spiritual superiority, creating what Jung privately documented as inflated helper identity. The belief that sensitivity grants special insight while actually serving as sophisticated avoidance of personal shadow work. The industry's gift narrative keeps empaths focused on others' healing, while systematically preventing them from addressing their own unresolved trauma patterns that created the compulsive helping behaviors in the first place. Jung's suppressed research revealed that spiritual communities often become unconscious feeding grounds for what he termed benevolent vampires, empaths who use their sensitivity to create emotional dependency while believing they're providing healing and support. This creates a perfect symbiotic system where empaths get to feel essential and spiritually advanced while their clients remain dependent and unhealed, ensuring a steady supply of the emotional intensity that feeds the empath's own unmet psychological needs. The archetypal possession operates through forces beyond conscious control, exhausting empaths while convincing them that their depletion is evidence of their spiritual service, rather than symptoms of unconscious psychological manipulation. Jung documented how helper archetypes can completely take over an empath's personality, creating automatic caretaking behaviors that serve the shadow's agenda of avoiding personal healing while maintaining superiority through appearing to heal others. Recognize the inherited strategies operating in your own relationships. The magnetic attraction cycle that draws you toward people who need your emotional labor while remaining unavailable for genuine reciprocal connection. These patterns recreate childhood sacrifice dynamics where you learn that your worth depended on your ability to manage others' emotional states, while suppressing your own needs and feelings. The people who consistently drain your energy aren't personal failures or bad luck. They're completing your ancestral contract, fulfilling the unconscious agreement that your nervous system was programmed to seek out and maintain. This recognition allows you to begin distinguishing between authentic spiritual service and unconscious trauma reenactment, disguised as empathic gifts. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking research on intergenerational trauma transmission provides scientific validation for what Jung observed clinically. Survival mechanisms encode themselves directly into the nervous system's DNA through epigenetic inheritance, passing empathic programming patterns across generations with remarkable precision. This research demonstrates that what empaths experience as sensitivity often represents inherited trauma responses that were never consciously chosen, but were programmed into their biology as adaptive strategies for navigating dangerous family and cultural environments. Modern neuroscience confirms that automatic caretaking behaviors aren't mere habits or personality traits, but deeply rooted neurological contracts that shape emotional responses, relationship patterns, and the basic structure of identity formation. These findings validate Jung's theory of archetypal possession, showing how inherited trauma responses can completely hijack an individual's nervous system, creating compulsive empathic behaviors that serve ancestral survival patterns rather than authentic present moment awareness. The neurological research reveals why Jung's patients showed such remarkable consistency in their empathic exhaustion patterns. Their brains were literally wired to prioritize others' emotional regulation over their own, creating what researchers now understand as empathic dysregulation syndrome that mimics spiritual gifts while actually representing inherited trauma responses. This explains why traditional spiritual practices often fail to address empathic overwhelm. They're treating symptoms of spiritual awakening rather than addressing the underlying neurological programming that creates compulsive caretaking behaviors. Jung's integration of psychological and spiritual understanding now has measurable biological correlates in discoveries about how inherited trauma creates specific neural pathways that automatically activate in response to others' emotional distress. These pathways bypass conscious choice, creating what feels like divine sensitivity, but actually represents unconscious enslavement to others' unhealed wounds, as a way of avoiding direct confrontation with inherited trauma patterns. Take a moment right now to identify your specific shadow contract terms, the invisible agreements that govern your empathy, the unconscious vows that determine when you feel compelled to absorb others' pain, and when you feel guilty for maintaining boundaries. Feel the ancestral weight of these contracts and begin to sense the possibility of conscious liberation from patterns that were never authentically your choice. The journey towards sovereign compassion begins with developing the capacity to distinguish between inherited empathic programming and authentic present moment responsiveness to others' genuine needs. Jung's contract dissolution protocols involve systematic recognition of how ancestral survival strategies operate through your nervous system, creating compulsive helping behaviors that serve unconscious trauma patterns rather than conscious spiritual service. The first step requires honest examination of your empathic responses, learning to recognize when you're responding to actual present moment pain versus when you're unconsciously triggered by inherited trauma patterns that compel you to absorb and process emotions that belong to other people or previous generations. This distinction becomes possible only through developing what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel your own emotional landscape directly rather than processing it through others' crises and emotional dramas. Lineage healing techniques for contract dissolution involve creating conscious relationship with your ancestral inheritance while refusing to continue unconscious service to patterns that no longer serve life. This means learning to honor your ancestors' survival strategies while choosing different responses that serve your authentic development, rather than perpetuating inherited trauma cycles through compulsive empathic service. The development of sovereign compassion requires learning to feel others' pain without automatically making it your responsibility to absorb, process, or heal what they're experiencing. This represents a fundamental shift from unconscious empathic absorption to conscious empathic witness. The ability to be present with suffering without being possessed by it, to offer genuine support without losing yourself in others' emotional processes. Creating boundaries that honor your ancestors while serving your authentic self involves understanding that breaking ancestral contracts isn't abandoning or betraying your lineage, but completing the healing work that previous generations weren't able to finish. Your liberation from unconscious empathic servitude actually serves your ancestors by resolving patterns that kept them trapped in survival mode rather than allowing them to access their full spiritual potential. Ancestral healing circles provide essential support for empaths navigating contract dissolution, because this work triggers intense resistance from family systems that depend on unconscious empathic service for emotional regulation. Working with others who understand the specific challenges of inherited empathic programming creates the safety necessary for dissolving contracts without losing connection to your authentic empathic gifts. Your liberation isn't just personal. It heals 7 generations forward and backward, creating ripple effects that transform your entire lineage's relationship to empathy, boundaries, and conscious service. This understanding provides the courage necessary for choosing sovereign compassion over inherited servitude. Even when family systems resist your emergence into authentic empathic power. Emerging from the dissolution of ancestral contracts, the conscious empath wears a crown forged from chains that once bound them to unconscious service, a symbol of sovereign compassion that serves life rather than perpetuating inherited trauma patterns. This transformation represents the completion of what Jung called the empathic individuation journey, evolving from inherited servant to conscious healer, who can offer authentic spiritual service without losing connection to their own developmental needs and authentic self-expression. The liberated empath no longer requires others to be wounded in order to feel valuable, no longer uses sensitivity as unconscious manipulation to create emotional dependency, and no longer mistakes empathic absorption for spiritual advancement. Instead, they develop the capacity for what Jung termed detached compassion, the ability to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, to serve authentically without creating dependency, and to maintain clear boundaries while remaining genuinely available for conscious spiritual service. This conscious empathy operates through overflow rather than emptiness, from authentic spiritual strength rather than unconscious need for significance through others' dependency. The sovereign empath becomes a mirror that reflects others' inherent capacity for healing, rather than a void that feeds on their weakness, a presence that empowers, rather than a force that creates psychological dependence on empathic intervention. Your transformation from unconscious empathic vampire to conscious spiritual servant contributes to the collective healing of empathic manipulation that operates throughout spiritual communities, healing circles, and helping professions. Each empath who chooses conscious liberation over inherited servitude creates space for others to examine their own ancestral contracts without the shame and resistance that usually accompanies recognition of unconscious empathic manipulation. The invitation extends to those ready to break the cycles that have controlled their lineage for generations, to step into authentic empathy that honors both your ancestral inheritance and your individual spiritual development. This isn't community based on shared wounds or mutual empathic enabling, but conscious collaboration among empaths who've learned to serve from wholeness rather than feeding from others' brokenness. Your willingness to dissolve ancestral contracts and reclaim empathy as sovereign compassion becomes a gift that transcends individual healing, contributing to the emergence of conscious empathic culture that serves collective awakening rather than perpetuating inherited trauma patterns. Remember, your liberation heals 7 generations forward and backward, a transformation that ripples through time itself, freeing your entire lineage from unconscious empathic servitude. The crown of sovereign compassion awaits those brave enough to dissolve the chains of inherited helping, to transform sensitivity from prison into authentic spiritual gift. Embrace your liberation and step into the fullness of conscious empathic service that honors both your ancestral wisdom and your individual capacity for authentic spiritual contribution to our collective awakening.